Good. Okay, thank you. Be careful. Okay, well, good morning, everybody. I hope you have noticed that we have a huge display of things for you to pick up today, lots of freebies. There's announcements about the UC-DC, University of California's program at the nation's capital. There are some informational meetings at the lower right-hand corner there, and I have some brochures here with the contact people. On September 11th, I don't know why that date sticks in my mind, there's going to be a concert and a speech by Jim Wallace. He's the director of Sojourners, the editor of that magazine. Shows you do not have to be a neocon to be an evangelical Christian. He's probably the point man for that whole movement, and he'll be here at the First Congregational Church of Berkeley, where I hope that we'll have an office one of these days. And then there's this things here from Matthew. Now as far as being in the class, the way things stand right now, I was able to get all the seniors on the wait list onto the rolls. So and one junior. So if you are a senior and you are on the wait list, you're now in the course. But at this point, I don't have any wiggle room, but we could try next week to see if somebody can drop out or take it under other auspices or what have you. If you were in the course and you were registered, even if you were a freshman, I'm leaving you strictly alone. I think this is a good way to start your career at Berkeley. I have a few sarcastic comments coming up in the back of my mind, but I think I won't go there. So those are those two things. Yeah, there's a documentary film called Ground Truth, which is about what has been happening to Iraqi veterans psychologically. The focus of the film is on how they're not getting much of the attention that they need from the Department of the Army, but that's not my concern. Our concern is with what happens to people who injure other people. This is the negative side of something that I'm going to be talking about in a little while. There's a new scientific evidence. And that film, which I've seen, is a very powerful film. There's going to be a special preview this Saturday and a showing in San Francisco on the 15th. Now, I didn't quite get the email that had the exact information, so what I'll do is send it to you on CourseWeb. So if you're free to those days, have an eye out for that. And the only announcement remaining that I can remember, I'm sure in the middle of the lecture I'll probably go, whoa, wait. But the only thing I can remember is that we've been approached by a teacher from Berkeley High School who wants to interact with us. He wants to have more connection between PACS students and Berkeley High students. We don't know exactly how this is going to work yet, but I think maybe at this point I would just ask how many of you would be interested in getting together with some Berkeley High students talking about nonviolence, stuff like that. Okay, that's more than enough to get something started, so let me pursue this with him. Yeah. The film is called Ground Truth. It's some kind of military expression. I don't remember exactly what it stands for. The concept that we'll be talking about is called PITS, P-I-T-S, which stands for Perpetration-Induced Traumatic Stress. We'll get to that in a little while. Okay, well, I hope that Tuesday's talk was okay. I don't know if you've been reading about this young man who got killed in Oakland, but one of my students was a close friend of his, and she had been in to talk to me just before I came to class, and I'm not sure I was totally all there on Tuesday. It was, you know, go ahead, Catherine. It was hit pretty hard by the grief that she was going through. But I've processed it, and I come out more determined than ever to work for nonviolence. So we should be in pretty good shape. Oh, thank you. Oh, you got both copies. You are the best, Eli. Thanks a lot. Excuse me 1 second while I look up something here. 4856, 319. Just don't want to have to stop in the middle of a sentence when I get to the point here. Yeah. Okay, good. Thank you. Now what we were talking about toward the end of Tuesday were some of the consequences. We're starting to come off the topic of what the physical universe is or is not, and which is, you know, not something that I don't know anything about, but that never stops me from lecturing on subjects. And I guess I should tell you what I want you to come away with from all of that. And let me get to that now. We were talking about some of the consequences for ethics and behavior of having that belief. And I mentioned two negative consequences that will have a direct impact on our belief system here. One is scarcity and the other was determinism. And I was saying very quickly at the end there, if you are operating under a paradigm of scarcity, it is not going to be possible for you to avoid competition for scarce resources, and resources are inevitably going to be scarce because if you're in a materialistic paradigm, you can never be satisfied. That's just a fact of human nature. One of the Sanskrit Upanishad says, na vittena tarpaniyo manushyaha, which, as of course you are aware, means the human being can never be satisfied by wealth. And once you start trying to be satisfied by wealth, there will be no end to that process. And I don't know if you've seen this slideshow that an astronomer has put together. He was trying to illustrate for his students the concept of a billion. A billion is a very big number, and we have a hard time wrapping our minds around it. I don't know if you've seen this cartoon of a manager in some corporation saying, "What? A billion is 1,000 million? Why wasn't I told this?" A very difficult number. So to illustrate it, he used the distribution of wealth or income rather in the United States. And he said, imagine you have a football field and everyone's wealth is represented by a stack of $100 bills. So the poorest people over here at the Stanford goal on the left, and their stack of $100 bills would not even show up on a computer image because it's not even one pixel. So you have the poorest people on the left, the richest people on the right. So what do you think that line, that curve would look like? You think it would go along for a while and then it would start climbing around the 80-yard line and then get pretty high, and then in the end zone, the Cal end zone, it would shoot way up there. But actually, do you know what it looks like? It's absolutely totally flat until the end zone, then it shoots up like this. It means the second wealthiest people in the world still don't have enough $100 bills to show up as one pixel on a computer screen. And these very, very few individuals, like 40 or 50 of them, have so much wealth that the line goes off the computer screen and you have to back up because it is higher than Mount Everest. So what he just stumbled upon was this incredible maldistribution of wealth in an industrial society because, as Gandhi would say, there's enough in the world for everyone's need, but there's not enough for everyone's greed. And people have modified that of late to say there's enough in the world for everyone's need, there's not enough for anyone's greed, because once it gets loose it's just going to suck up more and more material. So under this kind of paradigm you go from scarcity to competition, and from competition of course to violence. And it's just hard to avoid that in the prevailing paradigm. The other bad consequence is determinism, the idea that everything that you feel and think, who you are, is determined by something outside yourself, and that leads to a feeling of non-responsibility. Kevin, I think there's something in the corner there. And this is very closely connected with violence, and most of you are probably aware of the Milgram studies. You know, after World War II, everyone was shocked by the way that ordinary German people had participated in horrendous acts of inhumanity. And so psychologists got interested in studying what makes people follow orders like this, because that was the cliche. I was just following orders. If you're my age, you saw a lot of very corny movies in which these poor Germans would be brought out in front of a camera and made to say that. But Milgram studied not Germans but Yaleys, Yale students, because he was at Yale and those are the handiest students. So he did these studies. I don't think we need to go into the detail, but it is appalling the degree to which people will follow orders even if those orders violate your humane sensibility if they're put in some kind of structure of authority. In this case, all it was a person wearing a white lab coat. Same kind of thing that you buy cigarettes and used cars and toothpaste because somebody in a white lab coat says, this product, like that. So there's something innately destructive about thinking that you don't have to take responsibility for what you do. It seems to lie much closer to the core of violence than we might have thought. It's been pointed out that one of the biggest mistakes in modern industrial civilization has been treating a corporation as a person, which was not even a judicial decision. It was just some kind of a casual step that was taken very late in the 19th century that it was decided that corporations had rights. And then it was decided that people, when they acted in corporations, did not have responsibilities. So that I can invest a lot of money in a corporation that will be exploiting people in Thailand, say. In fact, if I had a lot of money, that's probably what I'd be doing because I'd invest it somewhere and who would know, who knows where that stuff would go. And I'm not responsible for what happens to those poor families in Thailand under the law. And it's been proposed that one of the best ways to fix the whole modern enchilada would be to take rights away from corporations and give responsibilities back to individuals. The name for a corporation in German is, you've seen probably GmbH, small m. You've seen that, you know, if you go to buy a Mercedes. Remember the last time you bought a Mercedes? So it's Mercedes GmbH. It stands for Gesellschaft mit begrenzten Heften, which means an institution with limited responsibilities. And that's what a corporation allows people to do. So, but in deeper ways also, this idea that we think, we feel, we act because of something outside ourselves over which we have no control and which does not even have a meaningful pattern is very demoralizing, very depressing. And so in various ways, this utter falsehood about human nature has created a great deal of violence. I want to add one more now before I go off this distressing topic to milk it for all the misery that we can get out of it, I wanted to bring back to mind, because we're coming up to 9/11, one of the things that President Bush said right after 9/11 when he went on the air to reassure people that things are going to be all right. I remember him saying, my job is to protect American people. And one of his suggestions to the American people was that we should take the kids to Disneyland. That's what he wanted people to do right after 9/11. Now on the surface, that meant don't worry, everything is all right. This is normal, you know, just go about your normal idiotic activities that you always do. But under the surface, what he was saying and what he has continued to say very consistently is that you have nothing to do with this. You leave it all up to me. And that's part of the non-responsibility, the determinism paradox that we're into. And now I'd like to add a real biggie, as if these things weren't depressing enough. But if you were this is all what happens, remember, if you believe that matter is primary and energy comes along somewhere and there's an appearance of consciousness, but consciousness is not a primary reality, which has led science to make terrific discoveries but has brought us into a very, very depressing paradigm. The third one I want to cite right here is separateness. It's very hard to spell when you're at a blackboard. You're way too close to the words. I hope that's all right because this is going out all over the world. If you believe that you are essentially physical, remember what Newton said about those atoms, those little particles. They are radically separate from one another in our conception. They're little, spherical, very tiny, utterly hard, indestructible pieces of matter, and there's nothing between one piece of matter and another. There's empty space. None of those things are believed anymore by real physicists, but now we're coming up to one of the problems that I've just barely hinted at before, that there's two different things going on here. There's the findings of science, real science, with which I, for one, have absolutely no problem. And then there's the story of science, what people think science is saying and what they agree to believe science is telling them. And unfortunately, those are two radically different things. Now, obviously, if you are in a paradigm of separateness and you think that you're radically separate from another person, violence is the way that you're going to get them to do what you want. And it's going to seem perfectly plausible that you could hurt another human being and that hurt would not affect you. And that's what the film Ground Truth starts to take apart. It to get into that very briefly, it's being discovered that the people coming back from Iraq, veterans, are much more traumatized by what they have done than what has been done to them. And in the prevailing paradigm, there is no accounting for this. Why should it bother me? So this is a good segue for us to get into the new paradigm that includes nonviolence and that we're going to try to build. But just to give you one glimpse at that, there was a set of articles in the New Yorker by a man named Dan Baum, and again his point was that the Veterans Administration is ignoring these traumatized vets. But if you read between the lines, a much deeper and much more poignant story comes out, and Dan Baum describes going into a VA hospital and talking to these amputees. You know, one guy has lost a leg, another's lost a hand, and so on. And they're joking about how their hand blew up and or they stepped on a claymore, lost their leg. And it's all, you know, boys will be boys, clapping each other on the shoulder, having a lot of fun with this. But then he said, oh, did you kill anybody when you were in Iraq? Immediately the conversation stopped. They could not go there. They would not talk about it. They did not want to hear about it. Because what they had done to people traumatized them much more deeply than what had been done to them. By the way, is Jean Yu here? Yeah. Oh, there you are. Okay. Don't let us go the whole day, Jean, without getting to your question. It was really good. I want to discuss it pretty soon. So the opposite of separateness that nonviolence proposes now we're going to go the other way with this, is a concept that we haven't mentioned here yet. So here's one of our typical examples of getting into one of the major concepts that I really want you to grok and be familiar with. Heart unity. Gandhi – actually, Jean, I'm going to use this as a segue to get into your question. This is going to work very well. Gandhi was faced with a situation of immense diversity in India. You know, we talk about America being a melting pot and all of that. And sure, you look around a classroom in Berkeley, you see a lot of diversity. But in India, there are like 200 mutually unintelligible languages. You have a whole sector of indigenous people. And then it's just diversity and communal discord was a huge problem. So in order to get out of it, he invented this concept of heart unity. Again, it's incredibly simple, and I really apologize for that, but it goes very, very deep. And heart unity simply states that I want your welfare. I want you to thrive, period. It doesn't matter whether you agree with me or disagree with me, whether you look like me, whether you're in the same religion that I am, whether you have the same amount of wealth isn't going to bother me. Even and here's where we're getting closer to Jean's question, even if you have more power than I have, I want you to thrive. Now that means that we're going to be establishing a very deep bond which will enable us to negotiate differences that we have without those differences becoming a cleavage plane for conflict. Now having said that I want you to thrive, please let's be careful here. It doesn't mean I want your agenda to thrive if it's a wrong agenda. If you're exploiting me, the best thing that I can do for you is to get you to stop exploiting me. And Gandhi said that he wanted the British out of India as rulers because they were ruining themselves. What they were with this unrealistic, unreal relationship of master to servant. And there's a famous hadith. Hadith is an oral story about the life of the Prophet Muhammad, that he was riding along with his companions one day and he said, you know, as I frequently said, you must help everyone. And the companion said, surely you don't mean that, Son of God. You mean we must help a brother, right, but not an oppressor, because Islam was really down on oppressors. So surely you mean we help a brother but not an oppressor. And the Prophet, peace be upon him, said, no, we help everybody. So this very stunned person said then, oh, how are we supposed to help an oppressor? And he said, by preventing him from oppressing you. Yeah.
There are some people that don't have a conscience, you know, like a sociopath or psychopath. I mean, it seems like they're disconnected from that. So how would they benefit from, I mean, it just doesn't matter what they do.
Okay, the question is, your name is Joy? Yeah. Joy's question is, what about someone who is so psychotic that they just think all they know is that they want to hurt you. They have no concept of separateness. I hope this isn't a good academic cop-out, but could we postpone that question a little bit? But that's the way this class works. It's not going to go away. It'll be there. I'm just waiting for it to come up at a point where we're better equipped to deal with it. But I promise you, trust me, that there is a way. There is a way to talk about that and deal with it. But what we're talking about here, heart unity, is a way of overcoming separateness without sacrificing diversity. And that's what makes the formula so powerful, because our first impulse when there's a feeling of separateness, which always makes us uncomfortable, even though we think that it doesn't, somewhere inside us there's this writhing, squirming, want to get back on the page with that person or persons, whoever they are. What we usually do is we pretend to all agree on something. In fact, that's how unanimous violence comes about. Just jot down that term, unanimous violence. We'll get back to that in about 8 weeks, I think. But for right now, I wanted to talk about heart unity and the way that it enables you to keep your connectedness with a person who is not only different from you, but who might conceivably be trying to hurt you in some way. And you've got to be able to stop them from doing that, and that brings us to Jean's question. Do you want to say what it was, Jean, and I'll repeat it for the
Well, I'm still at a restaurant, and
Mhm.
so I deal with a lot of customers and clients who sort of treat you as though you're not human or
Uh-huh.
your feelings don't matter.
Yeah.
And also with authority figures like
Yeah.
bosses who, think you're kind of down here while they're up there.
Yeah.
So my question was, how do you separate, how do you find a way to have your mind and spirit unaffected by such,
Great. So Jean's question is, she works as a waitress, which I also have done my share of that. Lots of Berkeley students do this at some point or another, and you may have noticed that customers don't typically sit you down and say, you know, so what are you majoring in, Jean? You know, let's talk about this. They treat you as a functionary, and then Worse than that, restaurants sometimes have owners, and they look even further down on people who wait on tables. And it's as though no one ever heard of John Milton, who ends his famous sonnet on blindness, "They also serve who only stand and wait." They don't notice that. So but more generally and more seriously, the question is, how do you deal with people who are disrespecting you? And why I thought this was a great place to stop and deal with that question is that this is essential in the whole question of nonviolence is respect. And the reason, remember we were a little bit startled about Gandhi putting himself in a position where he might starve to death, where no amount of waitresses would have helped in that situation, that there comes a point where even the sacredness of life is not an absolute, and it doesn't mean preserving life in your physical body at all costs. It seems that there is something to him which is more sacred than life, and that is honor. It may ring a little bit strangely in our ears, but you must never let anyone diss you. A friend of mine is a psychiatrist who has studied the kinds of people that you were just talking about, Joy, psychopathic individuals, multiple murderers. Sometimes these people are so sick that they brutally injure themselves just to make sure they can still feel and stuff like that. And he's a very good psychiatrist. He sat with a lot of these people and tried to get down to what it is at the very basis of their problem. In every single case, he finds that disrespect is the most potent factor in turning a person into this kind of criminal. That in their family they were not treated as a human being, and they just never get – the term diss, to diss somebody has become very common because disrespect precipitates a huge amount of violence. So this fits in very well with what we were just saying in this hadith, that you cannot allow someone to disrespect you because it hurts them. And Gandhi was insistent that if you disrespect someone – I love it. This is going to tie everything together beautifully. The whole today is really going to make sense. If you disrespect another person, you are damaging your own respect, your own value. In fact, the way he put it was, I have never understood how a person could believe that by insulting another human being, he would be gaining in respect. And that was a very important thing that Gandhi said, because Richard Attenborough read that, and as he said, I was so stunned by this that the hair stood up on the back of my neck. That's how theatrical people talk. They always have very powerful emotions about everything. But in his case, he went on to do Gandhi. He wrote that film 25 years and $25 million later because of that one insight that Gandhi had. And James Baldwin also said it's a mysterious fact that when I disrespect someone else, I disrespect myself. So you can't let them do it. What are you to do? Well, again, there's an interesting interchange between Gandhi and a questioner, which is not too dissimilar, Jean, from your question. Someone wrote to Gandhi and said, I've been reading all your stuff in your newspaper about nonviolence, and then I encountered this bully, and he slapped me in the face. What should I have done? Oh, no, sorry, I have to add one thing. He slapped me in the face, and I felt humiliated. What should I have done? Anybody want to guess what Gandhi told this man to do? Yes, that's the second most important thing, is not to or the second thing that comes up anyway, not to have felt humiliated. But what Gandhi actually said, first, hold on to your seats now. He said you should have slapped him back. Yeah. Because once you felt humiliated, it was all you lost it anyway. And it is much better to defend your honor than to walk away like those characters. You guys are probably too young. You never saw Charles Atlas advertisements, did you? Maybe they would be camp enough to come back. But in these cartoons, somebody would be sitting on the beach with his girlfriend. somebody looked actually sort of like me. And a big strapping football person would come by and kick sand in this guy's face and take away his girl. And this is called, I was a skinny 98-pound weakling. And it tells the story. But then this person goes and takes Charles Atlas lessons, and he's pumping iron, and he comes back looking like this. And he finds that bully and taps him on the shoulder and dukes him out and gets his girl back. And that's American success story sort of around this area here. So I suppose that's almost totally irrelevant, but I thought it would be a good story. But I guess it shows, you know, if you're not in a position where you have power, what are you to do? And Gandhi is purposely said to this guy, you should have slapped him back, because he knew that he was weaker and smaller, and it was not a question of overcoming the person physically. It was a question of getting back his own respect. But then he immediately said, why did you feel humiliated? You know, if you really are a follower of nonviolence, somebody slaps you in the face, you would feel sorry for that person. So you probably have some kind of problem. Yeah.
I mean, I know that Gandhi or yourself, no one's endorsing.
Gandhi or myself, I like that. Yeah.
Nobody's endorsing violence, but
Uh-huh.
I mean, is it sort of that you're saying if you're not prepared to be nonviolent, that it's, you know, it's better to confront problems instead of
Running away from it. You could very much say it that way. If you're not prepared to respond with full nonviolence, and the only choice you have, I'm going to put this into Gandhi's language. You got a question?
But how does that interplay with violence, principles of violence versus strategic nonviolence?
That's okay.
It seems sort of like that's a principle of strategic nonviolence versus, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Again, I'm going to ask your indulgence if we could put the question of principled and strategic nonviolence in a separate category. This happens a lot. You want to take all of these terms and line them up, and it doesn't really work. I don't think we're there yet, where all the terms, you know, the nonviolence terms in one column and the violence terms in another column. We're groping with these concepts because the field is still relatively new. So for now, let's keep the strategic and principled thing as a separate matter. We still have a very serious problem. What are you going to do if someone is oppressing or especially offending you, and let's say you've just signed up for PACS 164A, you don't know all of this stuff yet, what are you to do? The way Gandhi put it is, if you have a choice between violence and cowardice, if that's your only choice, choose violence. Now, I know that's very shocking from a person who devoted his entire career to nonviolence, but what he was saying is that cowardice is a form of violence. In fact, it's one of the worst forms. It's a form which makes violence possible. If there were no cowardice, there would be no violence. Nobody were threatened, there'd be no threat power. Okay? Hang on just a second, Joy. So, but then you should also do something else, and that gets back to your comment over here. You should, at the end of the event, when you go home and recollect in tranquility, like Wordsworth, you should say to yourself, this is not too great. I better learn how to respond with nonviolence because I don't want to go around slapping bullies in the face just to restore my honor because they can really pommel a person. In fact, we're in the science part of the course, so let's go back to animal behavior here for just a second. There's a part of the animal brain called the amygdala, which, as you notice, we're going to be talking about if we ever get back on track in a little while, where you stimulate the amygdala and it triggers fight or flight responses. And there's a way to stimulate it so that you can get animals to respond with aggression. Now, if you take a bunch of animals, they'll usually spread themselves out in a series of dominant to non-dominant, whatever they call it, what do they call it? Submissive, thanks. You have the most dominant animal, so I'm the biggest rat in the pack. You know, and then you have a little mousy rat who's the most submissive. Now, if you take a submissive rat, it's in its little group, and you put an electrode into its limbic system and shock the right part of the amygdala, it's going to be aggressive. And you know what the poor critter will do? It's going to get itself killed. It's going to run around and bite all those other rats until finally they say, well, you got some kind of problem, and they will take out that poor submissive rat. So it's very maladaptive. If you do this to primates, they can function a little bit better. You do this to a submissive monkey who's in a cage with some tough monkeys. The poor creature won't know what to do. His brain is telling him fight, but his culture is telling him you can't fight with these people. The poor creatures, they get under a table and have a nervous breakdown. I mean, it's a way of coping. There's no simian version of Prozac, so that's what they have to do. But if you do this, of course, you don't go around doing this to human beings. But on one occasion, when a woman's brain was being operated on and she was not asleep, she was conscious, they accidentally triggered this thing, and they asked her later on, how did you feel? And she said, I felt like slapping the surgeon, but I decided not to. So it's very interesting. As you go up the hierarchy, you get different layers of control over these animal reactions. But we're now in a situation – yeah.
What exactly do they trigger?
It's – I believe it's the amygdaloid nucleus in the limbic system in the brain. I left medical school after 1 year, but that's what they were calling it back in my day. So where were we? Jean is still standing there in her restaurant wondering what to do when these customers and these employers are disrespecting her. And I guess I'm taking a long time answering your question because A, I'm not really going to answer it, and B, I want to get out the basic principle here, and it's a very, very important one, that if you allow a person to show you disrespect out of cowardice, you are actually doing something which is even worse than being physically aggressive in terms of violence. Next week we're going to talk about actual an Indian theory of energy states, which will kind of correlate with this and maybe make it a little bit clearer. So what are we saying? What are we not saying? We're not saying that Jean should throw her tray down and smack any customer in the restaurant who shows her disrespect. But we are saying that you should not let that situation just slide. You should first of all solve it in your own mind and then decide what to do in the situation. And it may be that your relationship with these people is so casual that you end up doing nothing. But the one thing you should not do is to internalize the disrespect. You should never do that. When, you know, this is the problem with racism. This is why racism is an evil, is that people internalize what they've been told about themselves. If you refuse to do that, that is the beginning of the solution. Now, the way you actually work the solution out will depend on the situation. Okay? So this has been very rich, and I think it'll help us understand a lot of things that Gandhi said and did if you realize that human dignity, respect, and self-respect, it's all tied together. It's one of the most powerful ways that we connect with one another on the level of dignity. To disrespect a person is to break contact with that person existentially. To respect them is to be able to reconnect with them no matter what your social situations are, respective places in the hierarchy. Kevin? Yes, a lot of waitress stories now, yeah.
Same thing, I mean, like, it's always the same, but one thing that I saw, and it was actually after I read one of Gandhi's books, and is that there was their own suffering that they were trying to put onto him.
Yes.
And so as a server, I try and serve them, right, to really make him have a good time,
Yeah.
so even be nicer. And eventually I saw, you know, with some people that, like,
Yeah.
when you were being nice in the face of, like, you know, they were just being mean because they were
Mm-hmm.
or whatever, they were actually becoming
This very often works if someone is being nasty to you and you don't answer them with nastiness, their own nastiness starts to dissolve. That doesn't make Joy's question go away. There's some people who are so psychotic that the nicer you are, the more they're going to take advantage of you. So we will have to deal with that. I want us to lead up to it. Joy? Yes, using words in situations like this before they come to blows is, of course, a good idea. And we next semester we'll hear from a group called Nonviolent Communication, and this is exactly what they do. They figure out systematically how can you deal with a situation. As a matter of fact, the founder of Nonviolent Communication, Marshall Rosenberg, told me the following story, which I don't think he's published anywhere. But it gets us pretty close to your problem, which still is a big challenge. Of course, it might take us all semester. But Marshall was in a prison doing work in the prison, and he was asked to talk to somebody who was a difficult case. He had killed 7 people, number 7 being a prison guard. And nobody knew what to do with him. So this crazy Jewish guy from Detroit comes in and says, I deal with conflict. They say, okay, deal with him. And the next thing Marshall knows, he's sitting in a little room with this person who's not making eye contact with him. And the atmosphere in that room is not very comfortable. And Marshall couldn't figure out what to do. So he came up with this one. He said, I hear you've killed 7 people. The guy looked up and said, uh-huh. And Marshall said, well, what do I have to do not to be number 8? The guy was really taken aback. He said, oh, no one ever asked him that before. So he said, don't call me a liar and don't call me a son of a bitch. So Mark said, okay, pulled out his notebook. No liar, no son of a bitch. Good. Okay. And then they had a perfectly good conversation. Perfectly good. I mean, the guy's a psychotic murderer, but but they had a conversation. So what he basically did was he took that person seriously, even though that person was crazy, dangerously insane. I could think of only no, I'm not going to go there. But no, this person was a homicidal maniac, and yet Marshall said to himself, this guy has got to have a point of view. It's not my point of view. I'm not going there, but it's his point of view. And he's not capable of coming and looking at my point of view, so it's my responsibility to see things from his point of view and give him some respect, make him feel like a person, and then they could start talking. So toward the end of the semester and on into next semester, we're going to talk about the criminal justice system and how it does the exact opposite of what it's supposed to be doing. So is that okay, Jean, for starters for your question? Good. So let's now be a little bit more systematic about why it matters, what kind of physics and so forth that you believe in. And I want to try a simple little schema with you that would be a way of differentiating between the prevailing paradigm, sometimes called the dominant paradigm. I hate to call it the dominant paradigm, even though it's true, because I hate it that it's dominant. And let's just go roughly physical sciences, life sciences, and the social outcomes. Okay, we're going to be fine. In the prevailing paradigm, the physical model people use is material. So let's call it matter physics. And mind you, I'm not talking now about what real physicists do or believe, but I'm talking about this distressing fact that it's been 100 years now that they've discovered that matter isn't real in the sense that we thought it was. There's not an objective universe made of inert entities that we just casually observe. That isn't what's going on. They don't know how to describe what is going on, but for sure that isn't going on. That correlates with, and I'm being purposely vague about this because I don't know how to be any more specific, it correlates with competition biology. those two things seem to fit pretty well together. So Darwin comes up with this statement that he's worked very carefully on, and he spends a lifetime formulating it in a very subtle way, and immediately people snatch it away from him and they interpret it very crudely to mean survival of the fittest on the one hand and random mutation on the other hand. And they say this accounts for life. That's why you have things like Berkeley students walking around today, is because, you know, 900 million years ago there was some primeval slime somewhere around La Brea, and it was hit by a cosmic ray, and these molecules started accumulating in a certain way and sticking to one another, and it developed into life. And you can see why a religious person would feel uncomfortable with that model. In fact, there was a famous debate between Darwin and a bishop in which Darwin won. And that breach that's been created between science, what people thought science was saying, what they were interpreting it to say, and faith is with us to this very day. It's been a very, very damaging thing that's happened in Western civilization. So matter physics, competition biology, and you get all kinds of structural and interpersonal violence in the world. Okay? If you can't read this, this is the way these three things kind of correlate with one another, that if you think that that nature is consisting of inert physical matter knocking around without any rhyme or reason, that's what I'm calling matter physics. It correlates with a biological theory based on competition, and this is called social Darwinism, the output, where you say that anyone who impedes, let's say, economic competition is against freedom, and they must be godless communists and things like that. People must be allowed to compete with one another because that's what gives the world order. You let the competition go on for a long time, and then you look who's on top and you say this was the winner, and that gives you a sense of structure, order. I'm sorry if I'm being a little bit sarcastic and flippant about this, but I do think it's an extremely stupid model, and it's been very, very harmful. And what would be our equivalent in the emerging paradigm? When we started calling it the emerging paradigm back in the 70s, it still hasn't really emerged, but it's trying to. You have a consciousness physics and a cooperation biology and PACS 164A. Nonviolence is the outcome. Again, these two things can be pulled apart in a very stark and simple way on this level. So let me talk about the cooperation part of it a little bit, and I want to begin that by reading you a quote from a very helpful naturalist, originally Dutch, now he's living in Chicago. His name is Franz de Waal, and he had an experience in the Arnhem Zoo. It's a kind of experience which German behaviorists call ein Aha-Erlebnis, or aha experience. You know. They originally coined this term about chimpanzees. You give them 3 or 4 cartons and hang a banana pretty high up in the ceiling, and they look at it, and they look at the banana, they look at the cartons, they look at, and then suddenly one chimpanzee goes, aha! And they pile the cartons on top of one another, climb up and get the banana. So this is about Franz de Waal's banana. He's watching a bunch of chimpanzees, and they're having a terrific row. And as I said, chimps are pretty aggressive. This can be kind of scary. They're also humongously powerful, so you don't want to get in the cage with them. And then they work it out. You know, probably there was one chimpanzee has had a nonviolent communication workshop or something. He goes up to the dominant chimp and says, you seem to have a problem with me. Is there something I'm doing that's bothering you? And in their chimpanzee way, they work it out. And de Waal is standing there watching all this with his notebook. He's a very careful scientist. He says, oh my gosh, this is interesting. This looks like a reconciliation scene. So he said, I guess I'll go back to the library. They had these things called libraries in those days. You couldn't Google stuff. So he said, I'll go back to the library and do a literature search on reconciliation among primates. And so he went and here's this shelf number 1, aggression in chimpanzees, shelf number 2, aggression in chimpanzees, on and on and on. All of this stuff on aggression and reconciliation, absolutely nothing. And yet, as he said, every time a fire starts, it has to go out. Otherwise, we'd all be dead. If the first fight that ever happened, if there was no way for it to stop, it would have wiped out the world. The fact that it didn't shows that there is also a way of stopping fights. And it may be at least as important as starting them. But we're terribly asymmetrical about studying it. So he writes, and this is page 56 of my book, I speak from years of frustration with the literature on human behavior, except for reports on preschool children, one of which I may be talking with you about, and an occasional anthropological account. Hooray for anthro. I am unaware of data in this area. I recently asked a world-renowned American psychologist who specializes in human aggression what he knew about reconciliation. Not only did he have no information on the subject, but he looked at me as if the word were new to him. That's page 56. So Waal has started systematically studying this, and he has shown that there's a full spectrum of behaviors among chimpanzees and monkeys for getting into and out of fights. In fact, one of his early books was called Chimpanzee Politics. I thought it was sort of like predecessor of the West Wing or something like that. But no, he was talking about the politics of chimpanzees, not the chimpanzee-like behavior of politicians. And it seems that these animals have very complex and very sophisticated ways of negotiating difficulties among each other. And yet we systematically pick out the violence part and ignore the nonviolence part. There used to be a theory that was very popular called innate aggression, sometimes called the Tarzan theory of human behavior, that we have to be aggressive because of our genes. And people were making very popular books out of this, making lots of money. The books were sold in airport bookstores. And a group of scientists got together in, I think, 1980 in Seville and wrote something that became known as the Seville Declaration. And they said, it is scientifically false to state that we inherit only aggression from nature. It's scientifically false to state that we are doomed, we're condemned to follow out anything that we inherit on this level from nature. And that was a pretty influential booklet. And let's see. Okay. I think I'm going to skip around a little bit here. But you can now see one of the possible reasons why we resist things that are too wonderful, and that is that they can be challenging. Let me give you an example here. What I'm saying is that this model, which makes you not responsible, can be a more comfortable way to think about yourself and what you have to do. Once you start thinking that you have a choice between competition or cooperation, it's challenging. An incident which anyone who takes the course from me knows about within about 6 weeks is the Rosenstraße prison demonstration. This happened in 1943. I understand that a film has just been made about this called Rosenstraße, but I haven't gone to see it because the description of the film didn't sound like something I wanted to see. But what happened was, this was the end of April, I believe, 1943 in Berlin. There were about 5,000 or 6,000 Jewish men who had not yet been arrested because they were Mischlinge, as the Germans called them. They were half-breeds. They were married to Aryan women. But the time came to arrest them, so before dawn these trucks rolled out, collected all of these men and took them to a detention center which had been the Jewish Community Center on number 2 Rosenstraße, and started processing them for deportation to death camps. But what happened was their wives and mothers and daughters and sisters, they got upset. And they went down to the Rosenstraße prison and started to have a demonstration. You've heard of demonstrations. And they kept accumulating, and the Gestapo headquarters is only a couple of blocks away. They came out and said, this is an illegal demonstration. I'm sure it sounds even scarier in German. You know, well, they could have come out there with a machine gun and mowed these women down. Go home. Not only did they not go home, they started getting on the phone and calling other people. By the end of the night, there's like 6,000 women there. And people in charge of the operation didn't know what to do. They called Hitler and said, what do we do with these people? Hitler said, I wash my hands of it. Interesting. I'm not going to make a decision. And eventually, 3 days later, Goebbels, I guess it was, had to make the decision. He said, we have to release them. Because they couldn't, propaganda-wise, they couldn't cope with having a demonstration by loyal Aryan German women against something that the regime was doing. So this is a good case to know about, because if you start talking with your significant others about nonviolence, they'll say, oh, yes, but it would never have worked against the Nazis. Then you say, oh, really? Well, how about the Rosenstraße prison demonstration? And they'll say, the what? And then you can tell them this story, which you'll also find in my book. But one of the points made about this is when it was discovered, what had happened, and it wasn't discovered until years after the war, and one of the points was, why didn't we know more about this? If we had figured out what happened there, if we had realized that the Nazi regime was vulnerable to nonviolence, we could have stopped the whole thing. There'd be like 45 million people would still be alive today, and all of that never would have happened. And you know, it would have been much, much better for Germany. You never forget during the Nuremberg trials, one of the Nazi generals saying, this guilt of Germany will last for 1,000 years. So, you know, we could have saved them all of that pain, not to mention all the people who got killed. Because apparently they were much less powerful than they let on. So why didn't we know more about this? Why didn't we learn from it? One reason that's been proposed is that this is a terrible thing to think about. My God, we could have stopped that whole thing if we had just been more courageous and stood up. People, that's a frightening thing to think about, to know about. So for that reason, this whole episode was repressed. Okay, so let's move on now to actual studies of human beings. I think maybe I should stop here for a sec. We've been going pretty quickly. Anybody have any questions, comments about things that have come up? Okay. In the last I guess I want to talk about two things in this connection. I've talked about the opposite to separateness being heart unity. I want to talk about the opposite of scarcity, and that comes from a part of psychology called human needs theory. And the way it works is when I was in school, I was taught that, and mind you, I'm not against education, though I do occasionally pick quarrels with it. I was taught that human beings have three basic needs: for food, clothing, and shelter. And that was a model which was taken for granted and worked with for a long time, but it is not very rich model. It's not very explanatory. It says nothing about disrespect and things of that kind, which from a Gandhian point of view, once you got the food, clothing, and shelter taken care of, that's what you need to be a human being. So starting with Abraham Maslow, who's a well-known American psychologist, people have been exploring different levels and different kinds of human needs and putting them into hierarchies. And one model that is particularly useful for understanding nonviolence comes from a woman who was a recovering biologist. She was a biology teacher down at San Diego, began to realize that violence was the thing that people should concentrate on if we were going to get out of this alive. And she did her own work, and she came up with 3 terms which I find very useful. And in addition to, getting about 1,500 calories a day and enough clothing to walk around on a spring day in Berkeley without humiliating yourself, which is not a lot, admittedly, and having some place to stay other than some newspapers, what human beings really need to become fully human is bonding, autonomy, and meaning. Bonding means no one can live in isolation. You have to be part of some kind of group. Now this is, to make it clear, this is just one version of what human needs beyond the 3 basic ones could be. Bonding, autonomy, and meaning. Meaning correlates directly with the respect part. Autonomy correlates directly with the separateness part. Bonding, autonomy means – no, I'm sorry. Bonding – I'm sorry. So let's slow down here. I'm getting myself confused. Autonomy is more or less the answer to the determinism part, because it says even though you have to identify yourself in community and not just as an individual, there are certain decisions that you have to make that have to be authentic. They have to come from you, and you have to be allowed to make them, even if they're wrong, which is why Gandhi said, if you believe something to be true, even if you're wrong, for you it will be right and proper. Follow it. Remember we talked about persuasion versus coercion? This fits into that model too. You should never coerce somebody to do something which they secretly believe is wrong, because they're just going to wait for a chance when you're not looking to get back to it. Plus, you have damaged them by making them feel dishonest, cowardly, and inauthentic. So you find these strange, almost shocking episodes in his career where he will encourage people to do things that he knows is wrong because they don't know it's wrong. If they do it, they may find out that it's wrong. But if they don't do it because he told them not to, they'll never find out that it was wrong. You see the logic there? So we can come back to most of those things, but the part that I was just emphasizing here is the strange thing about human beings is that each of us has to be autonomous in some levels and bonded in other levels. And the other thing that we need is we need to have a meaning in our life. That's why I'm teaching a sophomore seminar right now called Why Are We Here? Writings on the meaning of life. Now, the interesting thing, the reason I bring this up in connection with scarcity is take a look at these needs. The wonderful thing about them is that they're inexhaustible. You know, they're not anything like crude oil or copper or stuff like that. In other words, if I have a bond with you, which I do, I'm not losing anything. If I respect you, which I do, I'm not disrespecting myself. Respect is not a finite entity which I have to take half of my respect and give it to you. It's not like that. The fact is that when I respect you, I grow in respect because you're human beings. I'm a human being, last I checked anyway. And in respecting you, I'm respecting all humanity, and that includes me. So the wonderful thing is that the higher human needs that psychologists have been thinking about and testing and coming up with bring us into an area where we escape from the problem of scarcity. The things that human beings really need not only are not scarce, but they seem to grow with use. You know, the more you love and respect people, the more you respect their autonomy, the more you feel that there's a meaning in life. They benefit and you benefit. So you have what's known. And again, this is the first time we're mentioning this, but we can get back to it later. You have what's known as a positive sum situation instead of a negative sum situation. In other words, in order for me to win, you do not have to lose, on the contrary. Whereas once we're stuck in the prevailing paradigm, we're going to have that all the time. It's going to be one winner and a lot of losers makes the perfect television program. It's called Survivors, as a matter of fact. Okay? So much for the scarcity part for now. Again, we can come back to these higher needs in different connections, but I just wanted to show you how we're systematically trying to get out of the prevailing paradigm and everything that it teaches. Now, for the next trick, I'd like to tell you about 3 studies which have become possible only recently because people have developed non-invasive ways of making some crude guesses about what's going on in your brain. You know, I told you about this poor woman who was being operated on and they accidentally zapped her amygdala and she felt like smacking the surgeon. Well, that's, you know, you can't do those experiments very often. There's something called human subjects regulation. So, you know, I'm reminded of a book by Tim Ferriss about cosmology. It's called The Whole Shebang. At one point in his book he says, now if I were to enter a black hole, or more realistically to send in a graduate student now this is not something that is very easy to do, is brain stimulation things. But they have now something called EMR, electromagnetic resonance, where they can tell which parts of your brain are being activated without carving you up just by putting electrodes in your vicinity. So I want to tell you about 3 discoveries, and I've given you just one entree into the literature on these studies. This came up this morning. I wasn't able to course web them to you. So this will give you a start on tracking down the actual science that I'll be talking about. The first is a concept called mirror neurons. I gave a lecture tour in Germany a couple of years ago, and I got out of the train. My host was waiting to greet me. He rushed over. He was so excited that he forgot to say hello and shake my hand, which is a very serious thing for a German to forget. But he was so excited because he had just discovered mirror neurons. So all the way back to the university, we had this long conversation, in very rapid German, by the way, about mirror neurons. And it turns out that there is, as you know, the central nervous system has a lot of neurons. I mean, it's just neurons all the way down. And there's a subset of these neurons whose specific function it is to mirror your behavior or your mental state. And as this has been explained to me, here I am standing up here in front of the room. Most of you are awake to my observation, and of those who are awake, most of you are looking at me. If I go like this, as I just did, the neurons that would trigger that movement in your arm, they fire off. Now at the last minute you catch them, you know, so we don't have the whole class going like this, not all like this, or any of these funny gestures that people use. But the fact is that anything that I do up here is being reflected in your central nervous system and heading on out towards the striated muscles and stopping just at the last minute. Moreover, if I were to have an emotion, say up here, let's say, pick an emotion, like if I were to get angry, which is just not very likely. I have nothing to get angry. If we stay off certain subjects, I should be just fine. But let's assume that I were to lose it up here. Someone use a 4-letter word starting with B, and I get very upset and angry. You would start getting angry physiologically. Your neurons, your mirror neurons would be picking that up. If I were to start weeping, which fortunately is not very likely right now. You know, I'm a guy. I don't cry. if I were to start weeping, your whole physiology up to the point of lacrimation would be fired off, and then at the last minute there'd be a conscious process would intervene and you would maybe not cry. Or maybe you would. You know, this does happen. People cry. Other people see them crying. They cry. So it turns out that this response is not just something that we pick up consciously with our brains and interpret and we say, oh, Jean, she's been dissed again in the sufficient grounds and she's crying, so I'm going to cry with her to show my sympathy. It doesn't happen like that. It comes up from below through the entire nervous system. So this is a very interesting fact, and it's only about 10, 20 years old. So now Einstein, God bless him, this would have made him rather upset, or he would have said, maybe I was wrong about spooky effects at a distance. They do actually happen. It's not just photons that are in quantum inseparability, but consciousness is unitary, and what one person does with their consciousness immediately impacts the consciousness of the observers. Okay. So that's mirror neurons. Now I want to move on to studies that were done in cooperation work. In the general area called games theory, which has a lot of interesting things to teach us about conflict and cooperation, but I can't follow the math, so I don't use it here. But there is an interesting game called Prisoner's Dilemma, and it puts a person in a situation where they have to choose to be selfish or altruistic vis-a-vis another player. In other words, you can risk having a little loss on your own side for the benefit of that person. And of course, mathematically it interests us because if you do that in a consistent, coherent way that the other player can pick up, both of you end up way, way ahead. It's a very robust system. But the part that I want to focus on here is they did some EMR on people who were playing Prisoner's Dilemma. Now mind you, this is not a very intense emotional situation. It's not like having an argument with someone whom you're close to. As far as you know, the person against whom you're playing could be a computer in some other laboratory. So it's not like there's an emotional bond there. But the interesting thing that they discovered is that when a person makes the decision to do something altruistic and benefit the other, quote, player, unquote, even if it's just an old Apple Macintosh in the basement of somebody's laboratory, that very decision to do something for another, para los demás, as they say in Spanish, fires off pleasure centers in your brain, which are only seen to be active when people are, say, having you know, a drug experience. I mean real drug experience like cocaine or things like that. Or to quote the discrete language of some of these workers in the field, certain other intensely pleasurable experiences. Okay? IPEs. So this is your body, your brain is having a reaction, an intensely positive reaction, even to a relatively low-grade, chintzy, little active altruism. So now you can imagine if you're in a novel like A Tale of Two Cities and you actually give up your life for somebody who looks like you, you stand up there and say, "'Tis a far, far better thing I do than I have ever done before." This is a physiological reality for a person. Okay. One more fact, and then we can one more type of scientific discovery, which I like even the best. That's why I saved it for last. And we can wrap this up and wrap the whole topic up. Trilina?
Do you have the opposite reaction, like if you do something selfish?
You know, I haven't read any work on that, but I know for a fact that, you know, it's only good science that it must be true. If you do something selfish, you're going to have an ulcer or, you know, the start of it. You know, that's how science works. I mean, if you have one side, you're going to have the other side. But that's interesting. Somebody should look at that. I don't know if they've identified the brain center that makes you unhappy and neurotic, the way they've picked out the pleasure centers. Okay, for my third and final card that I want to play in this deck. There was a discovery. Okay, as you know, we have the spinal column. I can't draw to save myself. Okay, so let's not take this too seriously. But there's a bunch of stuff called the low brain, the midbrain, and then there's the cerebellum on top of that. Okay, this is the part we use to take PACS 164A or design computers or things like that. This is new on the evolutionary scale. But this limbic brain here, which we have at the base of the cerebral cortex, is an inheritance where we're not too dissimilar from animals that are way, way further, much earlier on the evolutionary ladder. And in this lower brain, there is a limbic system which is responsible for really primal emotions. And in the limbic system, there's a little almond-shaped thing. And almond, the word for almond in Greek is amygdala. So some very highly cultivated physiologists discovered this, called this the amygdaloid nucleus. And now it's called the amygdala. And as you may be aware, it's very rare that there's a direct correlation between a part of your brain and an experience or a behavior. Most of the time the picture is way, way more complicated than that. But down here, if you stimulate the amygdala, it fires off the fight or flight response. So you call up the endocrines, get some more ACTH down here, or adrenaline, and if you're walking through the woods and you come around a corner and you see a mountain lion, which can happen in my part of the country, the amygdala will fire off immediately. Okay. So there was a very unfortunate discovery made, probably I think is about 15, 18 years ago, that if you show a person, you have a subject sitting in a lab and you can monitor what parts of the brain are firing off electronically, and you show them a picture and that picture is of someone from a different race, the amygdala fires off. It's an unfortunate fact. You're a white person, you're sitting there, a black face comes up on the screen, dot, 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 dot. It's sending out these messages. Now, there was a very insightful, very thoughtful team of researchers at Princeton, both women, Wheeler and Fisk, who said, this can't be the end of the story. There must be a way to get around this. And they designed a brilliant experiment which had a marvelous result. The experiment was very simple. Before they showed you that picture, they would ask you a question which would distract you from the fact that the person was of a particular racial outgroup. So they would ask you, okay, we're going to show you a picture now of a person. We want you to guess how old he is. Or, does this person like spinach? Or, can you find a dot that we've put in this person's face somewhere? So what are you doing? You're looking at the person as an individual, not as a racial stereotype. So they sit there with these machines and guess what? The amygdala response was completely negated. It did not happen. It was very dramatic. And this teaches us two things. One, that as we started saying a while ago, and we'll be saying it over and over again, violence is dehumanization. The minute you put a person in a category and stop seeing them as an individual, you're on your road to violence. And you're also going to be doing it to yourself. You'll be thinking of yourself in some kind of category, like I am a soldier, not hi, my name is Joe and I'm from Detroit and let's talk. The second thing it shows is that you can influence very, very deeply programmed negative responses through culture. So now let's back up and look at all three of these things and what they teach us. The mirror neuron thing establishes scientifically that when you change your mental state, you affect the mental states of people around you. This is huge because here we've been saying this in nonviolence all along and we had no vocabulary, no way to prove it. And of course, if you believe in matter physics, competition, biology, and the prison system, there's no way to account for this. So this proves that when a person – look, we're going to be looking at like 100 examples of this. Somebody comes up and threatens you and you decide not to be afraid. You decide not to hate that person. I mean, I was walking down University Avenue one time and suddenly I saw a biker. He was really a very dramatic biker. It was with leather and metal and swastikas and clankety-clank. And I thought he looked ridiculous and I started laughing. Then I caught the expression on his face that I want to stay alive. I will not laugh at the biker. And I could see, you know, he was getting ready to, you know, take me out and he immediately relaxed. So we can affect one another by our mental state. 2, it's psychologically extremely healthy to do something altruistic. Therefore, when Gandhi says make your life into a sacrifice, yatna and all of the stuff which we will be talking about, he's not saying we have to go against human nature. He's saying this is the highest evolution of human nature. And finally, to repeat, science is telling us that even deeply embedded negative reactions, fear, anger reactions, can be diverted by culture. Okay, now what we're going to do next week is look at an emerging paradigm. We're going to be trying to show you that the emerging paradigm already emerged about 5,000 years ago and that it is directly relevant also for Gandhi's background. Okay, have a good weekend. Yeah, come up and get some of this.